In September 1959, a machine arrived in New York City that no American office had ever seen. It weighed 648 pounds. It required its own dedicated electrical circuit. The building superintendent at one Manhattan law firm had to remove a door frame to get it into the copy room. Nobody complained. Within 6 months, there was a waiting list to rent one. The machine was called the Xerox 914. It made copies on plain paper in 7 seconds without chemicals, without stencils, without ink drums, without a trained operator. You placed a document face down on the glass, pressed a button, and 7 seconds later a copy came out the other end, warm to the touch, black on white, ready to file. A decade earlier, every copy made in every American office required a mimeograph stencil, a skilled hand, a drum of purple ink, and at minimum 20 minutes of preparation. The copies smelled of solvent. They faded, they bled at the margins, they were never quite right. The 914 changed what the word copy meant in the American language, not gradually, overnight. But here is the paradox that defines this story. The company that invented the photocopier, that built a machine so dominant, it held 100% of its own market, would watch its share of that same market fall below 50% within 20 years. The company that made copying effortless could not copy its own success. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the American companies that built the machines the office ran on and what the market did to them. Like the video and subscribe if that history matters to you. This story begins not in a laboratory, but in a storage room in Rochester, New York in 1944, where a patent sat unclaimed and an entire industry waited to be born. Chester Carlson was not an engineer at a major corporation. He was a patent attorney working in a cramped apartment in Astoria, Queens, New York in 1938. His job required him to copy technical documents by hand, slowly, inaccurately, page by page. He was also partially arthritic. The repetition was painful. So he did what patent attorneys rarely do. He invented a solution. On October 22, 1938, in a makeshift laboratory above a beauty salon in Astoria, Carlson and his assistant Otto Cornet produced the first xerographic image in history. They rubbed a sulfur-coated zinc plate with a cotton handkerchief to create a static charge, dusted it with lycopodium powder, a fine yellow spore used in pharmacy and pyrotechnics, and pressed a glass slide against it. The slide read in Carlson's own handwriting, 10/22/38 Astoria. The image transferred. It held. It was not a photograph. It was not a carbon copy. It was something that had never existed before. Carlson called the process electrophotography. He spent the next 6 years trying to sell it. IBM said no. RCA said no. General Electric said no. Remington Rand, the typewriter company that had more reason than any American manufacturer to understand office document reproduction, said no. The National Inventors Council reviewed the patent and passed. In total, more than 20 American corporations examined Carlson's invention between 1939 and 1944 and declined to develop it. In 1944, the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, a nonprofit research organization, agreed to develop the process in exchange for a share of future royalties. 3 years later, in 1947, a small photographic paper company in Rochester, New York, called the Hallowed Company, paid Battelle $25,000 for a license to develop and commercialize the technology. $25,000 for the invention that would generate billions. Hallowed was not a large company. In 1947, it employed roughly 1,200 people and generated $7 million in annual revenue, supplying photographic paper to commercial printers and government agencies. Its president, Joseph C. Wilson, understood that Hallowed needed a transformative product to survive competition from Eastman Kodak, which sat 12 miles away in the same city, employed 60,000 people, and controlled the American photographic paper market with a grip no small company could break by conventional means. Wilson did not buy the Carlson license because he understood exactly what it was. He bought it because Hallowed needed something Kodak did not have. What happened next was a decade of engineering work that nearly bankrupted the company 3 separate times. The word zerography was coined in 1948 from the Greek xeros, meaning dry, and graphia, meaning writing. Dry writing, no ink, no chemicals, no liquid developer. The name was proposed by a classics professor at Ohio State University, whom Hallowed consulted specifically to find a term that would be both scientifically accurate and commercially memorable. They succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Hallowed's first commercial xerographic product, the Model A copier, reached the market in 1949. It required the operator to complete 14 separate manual steps to produce a single copy. It was not a success. It was proof of concept, expensive, slow, and difficult enough that only the most committed institutional buyers adopted it. The United States Army Signal Corps used it for duplicating technical field manuals. The Veterans Administration used it for medical record reproduction. Both organizations needed a better solution than carbon paper and were willing to tolerate the complexity. Hallowed knew the Model A was not the product, it was the education. The product came 10 years later. By 1958, the company had spent more than $12 million developing xerographic technology, nearly twice its total annual revenue at the time the license was purchased. Joseph Wilson had refinanced the company's debt 4 times. Several board members had resigned in protest of the continued investment. Rochester's banking community had quietly concluded that Haloid was building toward an expensive failure. They were wrong by approximately $100 billion. On September 16, 1959, at the Sherry Netherland Hotel on Fifth Avenue in New York City, Haloid Xerox, the company had added the new word to its name 1 year earlier. In anticipation of this moment, demonstrated the Model 914 to a room of corporate purchasing executives, office managers, and business press for the first time. The demonstration lasted 11 minutes. The audience did not applaud at the end. They stood up and formed a line to look at the machine. The 914 was not small. It stood waist-high, measured roughly the size of a standard office desk, and weighed 648 pounds heavier than an upright piano. Its surface was a warm, institutional green, the color of government filing cabinets and hospital corridors, chosen deliberately to signal permanence and reliability rather than novelty. A flat glass platen, the scanning surface on which an original document was placed face down, sat on top. A single button initiated the copy cycle. 7 seconds later, a sheet of standard office bond paper emerged from the side, carrying a reproduction of the original document in sharp black toner fused permanently to the page by heat. The technical process inside the 914 zerography worked as follows. A rotating drum coated with selenium, a photosensitive material, was given an electrostatic charge in darkness. When light reflected from the original document struck the drum, the charge dissipated in the bright areas and held in the dark areas the text, the lines, the signatures. Fine black toner powder carrying the opposite electrostatic charge was then cascaded across the drum's surface. The toner adhered only where the charge remained, exactly tracing the image of the original. That toner image was then transferred to plain paper and fused in place by a heated roller. The entire cycle took 7 seconds. The drum reset automatically. The machine was ready for the next copy before the first one finished cooling. No stencil, no master, no chemical bath, no special paper, no trained operator. The 914's American list price was not a purchase price. Haloid Xerox made a decision that transformed not just the copier industry, but the entire model of American office equipment commerce. The 914 would not be sold. It would be leased. The base lease rate was $95 per month, equivalent to roughly $1.20 per month and $25, which included the machine installation, routine maintenance, and 2,000 free copies per month. Each copy beyond 2,000 cost an additional 3.5 cents. For a corporate secretary earning $72 per week in 1960, the machine itself cost more per month than her salary. For her employer, an insurance company, a law firm, a federal agency processing thousands of documents per week, the arithmetic ran the other direction entirely. The closest competing technology was the A.B. Dick Model 500 mimeograph, a stencil duplicating machine which sold outright for $375 and produced copies at roughly 15 cents each when stencil preparation time and materials were factored in. The mimeograph required a trained operator, a prepared stencil, and 20 minutes of setup for every new document. It produced acceptable copies in runs of 50 or more. For single copies or copies of documents already in final form, it was functionally useless. The 914 produced one copy as easily as it produced 1,000. That single fact restructured the economics of American office document reproduction. By the end of 1960, Xerox had placed 10,000 Model 914 units in American offices. By 1962, the waiting list for a leased unit ran to several months in major American cities. Fortune magazine, in a 1961 assessment, called the 914 the most successful product ever marketed in America. The company that 12 months earlier had been known only to photographic paper buyers was now a corporate noun, a verb, and a cultural landmark simultaneously. The moat was not the machine. The moat was the model. No competitor could match the lease structure, the service infrastructure, and the consumable supply chain Xerox had built around the 914 simultaneously. To compete with Xerox, a rival company had to build not just a better copier, it had to build an entirely parallel commercial ecosystem. In 1962, no company in the world was positioned to do that. In Rochester, New York, Joseph Wilson had renamed his company Xerox Corporation in 1961. Revenue that year exceeded $60 million, up from $30 million in 1959. The word Xerox had entered American vernacular as a verb, not a trademark, a verb, the rarest commercial achievement in the English language. The name on the glass platen was not a city of origin, it was a standard. By 1965, Xerox Corporation generated $500 million in annual revenue. By 1968, that number exceeded $1.1 billion. By 1970, Xerox held approximately 95% of the global plain paper copier market, a market it had created from nothing 11 years earlier in a hotel ballroom on Fifth Avenue with an 11-minute demonstration and a machine that weighed as much as an upright piano. No American technology company had ever grown that fast from a standing start, not in electronics, not in computing, not in communications. The 914 and its successors, the 813 desktop model 1963, the 2400 high-speed copier 1965, the 9200 continuous feed duplicator 1973 equipped the American institutional world from the ground up, office by office, agency by agency, floor by floor. The United States federal government standardized on Xerox equipment across multiple departments simultaneously. The General Services Administration placed Xerox copiers on its approved procurement schedule in 1962, opening every federal purchasing budget in the country to Xerox sales representatives. The Department of Defense used Xerox 914 units for field document reproduction at administrative installations across Europe and the Pacific. The Internal Revenue Service equipped its regional processing centers in Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Ogden, Utah, with Xerox high-volume duplicators to handle the annual surge of tax return correspondence. The Social Security Administration's Baltimore headquarters processed claims documentation through Xerox machines continuously 6 days a week for more than a decade. Outside the federal government, the institutional adoption was equally systematic. Every major American law firm above 50 attorneys had at least one Xerox unit by 1964. Every American hospital with more than 200 beds had standardized on Xerox for medical record reproduction by 1966. Every American newspaper of significant circulation used Xerox equipment for editorial copy distribution within the building. The copy boy who once carried carbon duplicates between the city desk and the composing room was replaced quietly and without ceremony by a Xerox 813 in the hallway. The American university system adopted Xerox equipment at a pace that alarmed academic publishers almost immediately. A faculty member who had previously assigned a required text one that students purchased could now place a single copy on reserve at the library and reproduce the relevant chapters for distribution at cost. This practice, which American publishers would spend the next 30 years attempting to litigate, began the moment the 914 arrived on American campuses. The machine did not recognize copyright. It recognized a document on its glass platen. The stake sentence belongs here in the middle of this institutional catalog because it is the moment that demonstrates most precisely what Xerox had built and why its loss would matter. In November 1963, the Warren Commission, the body appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, began its work in Washington, D.C. Over the following 10 months, the commission collected, reviewed, and cross-referenced more than 26,000 documents, 3,100 exhibits, and testimony from 552 witnesses. The document reproduction infrastructure that made that investigation operationally possible, that allowed investigators in Washington to hold copies of evidence being reviewed simultaneously in Dallas and New Orleans and New York, ran on Xerox equipment. The 26 volumes of the Warren Commission report distributed simultaneously to the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and every major American research university in October 1964 were assembled using zerographic reproduction at every stage of the process. The investigation of the most consequential American event of the 20th century depended in its administrative mechanics on a machine built in Rochester, New York 6 years earlier. That is what institutional infrastructure means, not market share, not revenue. The machine that the most important American government investigation of the era could not have functioned without. There is a sensory memory that belongs specifically to this generation, to anyone who worked in an American office between 1962 and 1985, and it is not the smell of mimeograph ink, though that smell was already fading. It is something more immediate, more physical. It is the warmth of the Xerox copy. Every sheet of paper that came out of a 914 or its successors was warm to the touch, heated by the fusing roller that bonded toner to the page surface at roughly 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmth lasted approximately 45 seconds. In offices where the Xerox machine ran continuously through the business day, there was a faint, clean smell of heated paper and ozone being the byproduct of the electrostatic charging process inside the drum assembly that was as specific to the American office of that era as coffee or carbon paper had been to the decade before. Trained secretaries in large offices developed an entirely new set of professional skills around the Xerox machine. They learned to judge paper curl the slight bow, a sheet developed when the fusing roller applied uneven heat as an indicator of drum wear. They learned the sound of a paper jam before the machine signaled it, a faint hesitation in the mechanical rhythm of the feed rollers a fraction of a second before the copy cycle aborted. They learned to clear a jam without tearing the sheet, which left fragments in the paper path and caused the next jam before the operator reached her desk. These were not trivial skills. In a large law firm or insurance company processing thousands of copies per day, a secretary who could clear a Xerox jam in under 2 minutes and return the machine to full operation was a professional asset with a specific demonstrable economic value. The Xerox service technician, the field representative who maintained the lease relationship, restocked toner, and performed periodic drum replacement, became one of the most recognizable figures in American corporate life. Xerox trained its service force at its Webster, New York facility outside Rochester, running a certification program that by 1968 had graduated more than 4,000 field technicians deployed across the continental United States. The Xerox service call, scheduled, reliable, conducted by a uniformed representative carrying a branded parts case, was the physical manifestation of the lease model's promise the machine would work, and when it did not, someone would arrive to fix it under contract at no additional charge. This was the moat that no specification sheet could capture. A Canon or Ricoh executive reading a Xerox annual report in 1968 could measure the revenue per unit, the lease rate, the copy volume per machine. What could not be read from a financial statement was the density of the service relationship, the 4,000 technicians, the Webster training facility, the parts distribution network, the institutional familiarity that made a Xerox machine not merely a piece of equipment, but a managed service embedded in the operational fabric of every major American organization that used one. Xerox understood this. For most of the 1960s, its leadership believed the service moat was permanent, that the complexity of building a comparable infrastructure would deter any competitor from attempting to enter the plain paper copier market at scale. They were right about the complexity. They were wrong about the deterrence. In 1968, Canon introduced its first plain paper copier to the American market. The NP1100 was smaller than the 914, slower than the 914, and produced copies of marginally lower quality than the 914. Its American price was $1,850 outright purchase, no lease required, no service contract mandatory. It weighed 139 pounds. 2 men could carry it up a staircase without removing a doorframe. Xerox's leadership in Rochester examined the Canon NP1100 and concluded it was not a serious competitive threat. In Rochester's boardrooms and executive offices in the autumn of 1968, that conclusion felt reasonable. Within 10 years, it would look like the most expensive miscalculation in American office equipment history. The first warning arrived not from Japan, but from Washington. In 1973, the Federal Trade Commission filed an antitrust complaint against Xerox Corporation, alleging that the company had used its patent portfolio, more than 700 zerography-related patents accumulated since 1947, to construct a legal barrier around the plain paper copier market that no competitor could legally penetrate. The complaint was not unfounded. Xerox had licensed its technology selectively and priced those licenses prohibitively. It had built a patent wall as deliberately as it had built its service network. The FTC settlement reached in 1975 required Xerox to license its zerography patents to any competitor that requested them at nominal royalty rates. Effectively, the United States government handed Xerox's core intellectual property to the global copier industry on a single afternoon in January 1975. Canon, Ricoh, Savin, Minolta, and Sharp had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Japanese response was not incremental. It was structural. Where Xerox had built its market on the lease model, high monthly fees, mandatory service contracts, per copy charges, Japanese manufacturers entered the American market selling machines outright at prices that made the lease calculation irrelevant. The Savin 750, introduced to the American market in 1975, used a liquid toner process that simplified the internal mechanism sufficiently to reduce manufacturing cost below anything Xerox could match on its existing production lines. Its American retail price was $3,475, a one-time payment that included the machine and a 1-year parts warranty. No monthly fee, no per-copy charge, no service representative arriving on a scheduled rotation. The American office manager who had paid $95 per month for a Xerox lease won $140 per year before overage charges could now buy a Savin outright and recover the capital cost in roughly 3 years. The economics were not complicated, they were not answerable. Xerox's market share in plain paper copiers, which had stood at 95% in 1970, fell to 86% by 1974, to 72% by 1976, to 54% by 1978, to 46% by 1980. In 10 years, Xerox lost half the market it had invented. The internal response at Rochester was a combination of genuine engineering effort and catastrophic strategic miscalculation. On the engineering side, Xerox invested heavily in developing smaller, cheaper copier models to compete with Japanese mid-range machines. The Xerox 3100 1973 and the 4000 series 1977 were credible products at competitive price points. They slowed the market share erosion. They did not reverse it. The strategic miscalculation was PARC. In 1970, Xerox had established the Palo Alto Research Center in California, 3,000 miles from its Rochester manufacturing base, and staffed it with the most accomplished computer scientists, engineers, and interface designers in the United States. Between 1970 and 1980, PARC produced the Alto personal computer, the graphical user interface, the computer mouse Ethernet, networking, the laser printer, and object-oriented programming. Every foundational technology of the modern computing era was developed, demonstrated, and documented at a facility owned by Xerox Corporation. Xerox commercialized one of them. The Xerox Star workstation, introduced in 1981 at $16,595 per unit, brought the graphical interface and the laser printer to the commercial market simultaneously. It was technically magnificent. At $16,595 per station in a market where the IBM PC had just launched at $1,565, it was commercially unreachable. The Star sold fewer than 30,000 units in its entire production run. Steve Jobs visited PARC in December 1979. He saw the Alto's graphical interface demonstrated for approximately 90 minutes. The Macintosh launched in January 1984. The Windows operating system reached mass market by 1990. The technologies that Xerox invented and declined to commercialize at accessible price points became the foundation of an industry worth trillions of dollars, built by other companies in other cities, generating revenue that never reached Rochester. The copier market continued its erosion. Canon passed Xerox in global unit sales in 1982. Ricoh captured the mid-volume segment. Minolta took significant share in the small office market. By 1985, the independent office equipment dealer, the same dealer network that had installed Xerox machines in American law firms and insurance companies throughout the 1960s, was selling Canon and Ricoh alongside Xerox, or instead of it, depending on the customer's price sensitivity. The factory numbers told the story without ambiguity. Xerox employment in Rochester peaked at approximately 15,000 workers in 1980. By 1985, it had fallen to 9,000. The Webster Service Training Facility, which had certified 4,000 field technicians at its peak, reduced its programs. The uniformed Xerox service representative, once the most familiar face in American corporate facilities management, became less common, then rare, then a memory. Revenues held, disguising the structural damage. Xerox remained a billion-dollar company through the 1980s and into the 1990s. But the revenue increasingly came from higher-end production systems and financial services, a diversification that Rochester's leadership pursued aggressively, and that Wall Street rewarded briefly before concluding that a copier company running a financial services division was neither a good copier company nor a good financial company. By 1990, Xerox had exited financial services at a loss. By 1995, its share of the global copier market had fallen below 20%. By 2000, it was 13%. The company did not close. It did not file for bankruptcy. It contracted. It reorganized. It sold divisions. It licensed the name. It survived in the way that a building survives when its interior has been stripped to the studs and the facade is all that remains standing on the original foundation. The 914 still existed in corporate memory. The company that built it barely resembled the organization that had stood in the Sherry Netherland Ballroom in September 1959 and watched a room full of office managers form a line to look at a machine that made warm copies in 7 seconds. Rochester remembered. The market did not. The Xerox 914 units that survived their lease cycles were not discarded. They were too heavy to discard casually. Several hundred were donated to American universities and vocational schools in the mid-1960s when Xerox replaced them with faster models. A small number were acquired by regional history museums. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., holds a Model 914 in its permanent collection, cataloged not under office equipment but under American innovation, in the same wing that houses the original Star-Spangled Banner and the first American locomotive. That categorization is not accidental. The curators who placed the 914 in that context understood something that Xerox's own leadership occasionally lost sight of. The machine was not a product. It was an event. It divided American office history into before and after as cleanly as any technology in the 20th century. The collector community that has formed around early Xerox equipment is smaller than the typewriter restoration community. There are no Xerox 914 eBay listings averaging $150 in working condition because a working 914 weighs 648 pounds and requires a dedicated electrical circuit, but it is serious. The Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California maintains documentation archives on the 914's engineering development. The Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware holds Hallowed Company corporate records from the late 1940s and early 1950s. including correspondence between Joseph Wilson and the Battelle Memorial Institute that traces the commercial development of zerography from $25,000 license to billion-dollar industry. Researchers who have worked through that correspondence report that Wilson's letters from 1953 and 1954, when the company had spent more than it earned on xerographic development for 6 consecutive years, read with a quality of controlled desperation that only makes sense in retrospect, knowing what arrived 6 years later. The professional categories that the 914 created and then in its own obsolescence eliminated deserve their own accounting. The Xerox service technician certified at Webster, New York was a distinct American professional identity from approximately 1960 to 1990. At the field force's peak in the late 1960s, more than 4,000 Xerox-certified technicians worked across the continental United States, each responsible for a defined geographic territory of leased equipment. They carried branded parts cases. They wore company uniforms. They held service certifications that were transferable within the industry and recognized by competing manufacturers as evidence of genuine technical competence. When Xerox's market share collapsed and the lease model gave way to outright equipment sales, the service infrastructure that had been the company's primary competitive moat became its primary cost liability. The technicians were reduced in number, then retrained for different equipment lines, then retired or displaced, as the machines they serviced were replaced by units engineered to be disposable rather than repairable. The Xerox copy room operator, the trained administrative professional in large American organizations who managed document reproduction as a defined job function, disappeared more gradually but just as completely. By 1995, desktop laser printers had distributed document reproduction to individual workstations throughout American offices. The copy room, which had been a defined physical space in every significant American organization since the early 1960s, became a storage area or a conference annex. The operator who had managed it, who had known the machine's rhythms and tolerances well enough to keep it running through a 10-hour production day, had no successor job title. The surprise footnote belongs to Chester Carlson, who in 1968, 9 years after the 914 launch, having received royalty payments that made him one of the wealthiest inventors in American history, gave away the majority of his fortune to charitable causes before his death in New York City on September 19th of that year. He died with an estate of approximately $150,000. The man whose 1938 experiment above a beauty salon in Astoria, Queens, generated an industry worth tens of billions of dollars, kept almost none of it. By his own account, he found the wealth an inconvenience. He found the invention sufficient. In the lobby of the Xerox Corporation headquarters in Norwalk, Connecticut, the company relocated from Rochester in 2018, another quiet diminishment. There is a reproduction of the original 1938 experimental slide, the one that read 10/22/38 Astoria. It is displayed behind glass at eye level beside the reception desk. The machine that slide eventually became weighed 648 pounds and changed every office in America. The slide itself weighs almost nothing. We tell these stories because the machines that ran the American office deserve to be remembered with the same precision that built them one brand at a time, one city at a time, one decade at a time. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. And remember, in October 1959, 1 month after the 914 stood in a New York hotel ballroom and rewrote the meaning of the word copy, Olivetti signed the papers acquiring Underwood in Hartford, Connecticut. The machine that created the American office and the machine that had equipped it for 60 years arrived at their defining moments in the same autumn. One was a beginning, one was an ending. In the American office, they were always the same story,